The silk sheets cost more than a mid-sized sedan. But to Diane, they feel like fiberglass, a luxurious, abrasive cage that rasps against her skin. She lies rigid, her gaze pinned to the ceiling, tracking the rhythmic neon blue pulse of the humidifier. Every shadow in the room is a witness. Every shift of the house's foundation is a judgment. By day, she is the creator of $1 million lifestyle brand, the oracle who sells the dream of having it all to millions of women desperate enough to buy it. She sells linen-clad afternoons, organized pantries, and the serene, untouchable beauty of a woman who never cries. But here, in the hollow of the night, she is coming apart at the seams, a structural failure disguised in high thread count cotton. With a jagged breath, she reaches for the nightstand. Her hands, those steady, practiced instruments that sign $1 million contracts and curate the perfect aesthetic for the masses, are trembling with a frantic, unearned energy. She fumbles for the amber bottle, the plastic rattling against the lamp like a dry, frantic heartbeat. She shakes out 2 of her off switches. She calls them medicine. They are actually erasures. Without them, the inventory in her head, the plummeting engagement numbers, the passive-aggressive emails from staff, the fraying edges of her own public persona, becomes a cacophony, a screaming choir she can't silence. She swallows them dry. They taste like chalk and the metallic tang of a temporary death. Beside her, the machine begins its ritual, the hiss-click of the CPAP. To the world, it is a medical necessity, a hum of health. To Diane, it is the sound of a man slowly evaporating. She stares at the back of Grant's head, obscured by the grotesque architecture of straps and translucent plastic. She wonders if he wears it as armor, a deliberate synthetic barricade he has erected to ensure he never has to feel the vibration of her rage or the frantic, jagged heat of her anxiety against his skin. Has he finally opted out of the marriage, retreating into filtered, measured breathing while she drowns in the musty, old memories of their room? It could easily be a slow-motion abandonment, one breath at a time. And she watches, counting the seconds between his inhalations, to see if he's still keeping secrets in the gaps. Grant stirs, the movement infinitesimal, yet it sets off a siren in Diane's chest. He doesn't wake, but he shifts, his hand sliding across the sheets to rest on her hip. It is a heavy weight, a tether. He is checking to see if she is still alive, or if she has finally drifted into the abyss, finally free from where she keeps the memory of his lies. She traces the jagged silhouette of her life now, trying to map the exact moment the world curdled. It's a bitter, hollow ache. The memory of who she was before his hiccups became the tremors that leveled her reality. Back then, she hadn't yet learned to armor her skin. She was a soft, frantic thing, an open wound of a woman who bled hope because she still believed, with a devastating, naive fervor, in the us she thought they were building. She remembers the ghost of that girl, and she hates her for ever being foolish enough to have trusted the hands that would eventually dismantle her. As she lay in the dark, the quiet of the room a stark, heavy contrast to the turbulence that still echoed in her memory. Even now, after 2 decades, the recollection of that departure tasted like copper and old tears. It hadn't been a calculated exit. It was a soul-deep collapse. She remembered the way her heart had felt, not like a rhythmic organ, but like a bird battering its wings against the cage of her ribs, desperate for air that didn't smell of his unspoken secrets. She had fled to the other side of the globe, a woman untethered and spiraling. There was no map, No itinerary, just the agonizing, numbing weight of a grief she couldn't name. She moved through European streets as if submerged in deep, frigid water, her mind a static-filled void. The sorrow was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache that sat behind her eyes, making every breath a conscious, grueling effort. She was utterly paralyzed, trapped in a chasm between the life she had been forced to abandon and the terrifying, empty reality of who she was without it. Then, the news reached her across the miles. The whispered divorce. Even before she had fully unraveled the secrets of the lake house, she realized she had been bracing for the crash. She had prepared herself for the absolute disintegration of their world. The media frenzy, the rumors of infidelity, the crumbling of the brand, and the devastating fallout for their children. She could already see the vultures circling, waiting to pick apart the carcass of their public life. She convinced the world she was on a retreat, a long overdue vacation. Later, when she read those lies in the sterile glow of a hotel room, or watched a prying interviewer sneak in their invasive questions, a shiver ripped through her, a mixture of cold dread and a strange, disorienting relief. She had woven a narrative so seamless, so utterly mundane, that the scandal was smothered in its crib, and Grant had stepped into the breach and built a shield of normalcy, ensuring that children would never have to read the sordid, manufactured headlines that would have surely destroyed them. She remembered curling into a ball on the edge of the bed, the tears finally coming. Not in a cathartic release, but in a slow, jagged leak. She felt a haunting cold gratitude. She allowed the lie to solidify, letting it become the armor they both wore. By protecting the image, by curating the illusion of a vacation, they had preserved the only thing that could keep their life intact. It was a terrible, beautiful irony. She had sacrificed her own peace, her own ability to scream for the truth, just to keep the foundation from sliding out from under their children and her brand. She had retreated into the lie to keep their family and business from being dismantled by the public eye. It was a brilliant lie later, polished by the quiet detachment of her medication. The narrative became a jagged piece of performance art, a story she learned to recite until the lines between the truth and her nightly pills blurred into a single, sedative haze. It was a convenient tragedy, the kind that looked respectable on paper. The regret is no longer a mere feeling. It is a cold, immutable sculpture of lead anchored behind his ribs, a weight he knows will press against his lungs until his final breath. He watches her now, this creature of grace and distance, and he is undone by a love so agonizing it feels like drowning in shallow water. It is a terrifying, desperate devotion, refined and sharpened by the brutal knowledge that he is the one who took the blade to her soul. He understands now that he was not a singular man, but a vessel for fracturing impulses, waiting for someone to finally hold up the mirror. He had been wandering into the thicket long before she discovered that first secret, blind to the way his choices were silently rewriting the architecture of his heart. She wondered how long the descent had truly been. If she had caught the shifts in his rhythm, the subtle drifts in his focus, would he have retreated from that path before he was fully consumed by it? She was haunted by the possibility that had she acted the moment the air in the house first turned cold, she could have pulled him back from the edge before their lives was permanently stained by his hands. Knowing Grant, he would have razed his own world to the ground to keep her light from dimming. He would have been saved utterly and completely by the simple gravity of her gaze. But she hadn't seen it, and he, in his arrogance, had mistaken her absolute trust for an inexhaustible resource. He treated their vows as a sacred contract that somehow exempted him from the darkness he was gathering behind locked doors. He thought he was a good man because his intentions were anchored in his love for her. He truly believed their life was an unbreakable sanctuary. But when she unearthed the truth, the world ended. But the real casualty was the version of her that survived. He watched her mind retreat into a fortress he couldn't breach, a place where he was no longer a partner, but a stranger she was forced to endure. Now, his existence is a grueling, quiet liturgy of penance. He lives for the smallest, most invisible ways to make her days more bearable, to pave a smooth road beneath her feet, even though he knows the woman he fell in love with evaporated the moment she walked into that room and saw what he had been concealing. He is a man performing a resurrection he knows is impossible. He remains because he has no right to leave, watching her from the periphery with a heart that has grown too large for his chest. Grant stares into the dark, the plastic harness of the CPAP biting into the bridge of his nose. She views it as a barricade, a synthetic wall he has erected between them. He lets her harbor that resentment, but it is a quiet that keeps the silence between them from ever becoming truly peaceful. The silence between them is not a sanctuary. It is a fracture, a jagged thing that refuses to mend. It is a quiet that vibrates with the frantic hum of everything left unsaid. Never allowed to settle into the grace of true peace, he finds himself drifting back to the bend in the river, to the exact moment their world curdled. That night, when she finally crossed the threshold and found him. The air had been heavy, cloying with the scent of pine and the suffocating weight of the life he had been building in the shadows. Now, tethered to the rhythmic, heartless pulse of his machine, he breathes in air that tastes of nothing but cold metal and regret. As the sterile wind brushes his lungs, he is haunted by the sharpness of his own negligence. He wonders how he could have been so blind, how he stood so still, never sensing the storm gathering in her eyes, never realizing that the secrets he buried were, all along, digging his grave. Grant had existed in the shadows for a lifetime, a man carved from secrets, until she arrived and stole the very heart he didn't know he possessed. She was his salvation. She took his jagged, illicit schemes and refined them, tenderly architecting his success, managing the empire they built as if it were a garden. She was the quiet mending of a long broken spirit, filling the jagged, hollowed-out spaces that those selfish, hollow women had left behind in him. She gifted him a daughter, then a son, a legacy of light. He had promised his own soul that he would stop. He had sworn to bury the darkness forever because she was everything. She was the pulse in his wrists and the air in his lungs. But greed is a cruel, intoxicating whisper. As the business surged, climbing with a ferocity that outpaced his own wildest ambition, the old, insatiable hunger clawed its way back up through his veins. He chose the climb over the comfort. He chose the phantom promise of more over the profound perfection of enough. Now he is left to face the ghost of that decision, haunted by the crushing, silent weight of his own betrayal. Was the life they shared, the warmth of her hand, the laughter of their children, the absolute grace of being known, truly not enough to anchor him? How could he have looked at his own paradise and decided he was still starving? 3 days after she discovered his dark and stale secret, the kitchen was a tomb. He sat at the table, his palms pressed flat against the wood, trying to anchor himself to a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. His mouth was a desert of ash. His voice had withered away, leaving only the sound of his own ragged, fevered breathing. Even his hair felt brittle, as if the very life had been drained from him by the sheer agonizing weight of the truth. He sat in the ruins of a life he had dismantled with his own hands, shivering as the air grew heavy with the sound of her departure. He could hear them, the children, their cries cutting through the silence like serrated blades, a chorus of confusion born from the anomaly of this disorder he had brought into their home. He could not lose her. He could not lose them. But he would not stop her, and he would not hurt her. Not now, not ever again. The problem with a life lived on a stage is that when it breaks, the curtain doesn't come down. You just have to keep performing, even while you're bleeding out. For Diane, the house wasn't just burning, her legacy was too. She had poured every drop of herself into him. She'd given him her best years, her trust, and the 2 children who were the only pure things left in their world. When she found that secret, the one thing she couldn't forgive, the one thing that turned everything they built into a lie, she didn't just leave, she vanished. She was rich, she was hurt, and she had the means to buy a whole ocean between them. 1 week later, the phone rang. A PR suit had already started the panic, questioning why she'd fled to another country with the kids. Grant didn't care about the headlines. He didn't care about the stock prices or the whispers in the city. He would have burned the whole industry down if it meant getting her to look at him again. He was desperate, clawing at the air, just trying to reach her. But when she spoke, her voice was cold, clipped, and hollow. She didn't want to talk about the lake house. She didn't want to talk about how she used to love him. She just had a plan. To her, this wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a damaged asset. She was already back in the role, arranging the pieces, fixing the optics, making sure the world didn't see her as a woman betrayed, but as a brand that stayed intact. He realized then that he had lost her twice. First, when he broke her heart, and now, as she folded his love into a strategy to save her own skin. Grant moves through their home like a spectre, a man haunting his own life. He wears the mask of the devoted husband with a desperate, trembling precision. But every gesture, the gentle brush of his hand, the way he lingers in the doorway to watch her, is a silent, frantic prayer. It is no longer just a performance for the public, not anymore. It is a man trying to buy back the soul of a woman who has already retreated behind a wall of ice. The house holds a cold that no fire can touch. It settles into the marrow of his bones, an ache that intensifies when the sun goes down. Then the nights come. He retreats to his side of the bed and adjusts the mask, the steady, rhythmic hiss of the CPAP machine filling the silence of the room. It is a small, clinical sound, but in the dark, it feels like a barrier, a wall of plastic and humming air that stands between them, a sterile divider in the place where they once breathed as one. He lies there, tethered to the machine, staring at the ceiling as his mind drifts back to the years before the fall. He remembers how she waited. He realizes now that she hadn't just stumbled upon the truth. She had been circling it for years. She had felt the tremors in their foundation, the way he would pull away, the way his secrets bled into their shared air. She had watched him with a quiet, terrifying patience, waiting for the moment he would finally slip, waiting to confirm the horror that her intuition had been whispering to her all along. When she finally pulled the mask from his life, she had gone looking for a common sin. She had expected to find a woman, an affair, a sordid story of flesh and blood, the kind of betrayal that is messy, human, and perhaps, eventually, forgivable. She had wanted to find a villain she could understand, but she found something else. And as he lies there, the soft, mechanical pulse of the air keeping him steady, he is crushed by a bitter, hollow wish. If only she had been right. He would have given anything for the betrayal to be so simple. He would have gladly borne the weight of being the man who cheated, the man who split his heart between two homes, if only the truth was something she could categorize and discard. It would have been easier for her. It would have been a wound that could bleed and eventually scab over. But instead, she chose to stay, knowing exactly what he was. She walked back through their front door, not because she had forgiven him, but because she had no other choice. And every night, as he waits for sleep, he realizes that the true torture isn't the distance or the silence. It is knowing that she is lying there beside him, hating him for a secret so dark it makes him wish he were nothing more than a common, unfaithful husband. For 6 years, the marriage was a steady, golden fortress, a life built on solid ground. They were partners, they were lovers, and they were enough. Then, the air shifted. The change was a subtle poison, an imperceptible fraying of the edges. He began to slip away into the grey margins of their days, a business trip that didn't add up, or a shadow that seemed to linger in his eyes long after he turned back to her. He was physically present, but the man she knew was becoming a phantom, retreating into a world she wasn't allowed to see. For 2 long, agonizing years, she lived in the wake of his absences. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Instead, she became a silent observer, gathering the jagged shards of his lies. She tracked the patterns. She documented the inconsistencies. She learned the exact rhythm of his withdrawals, realizing with a cold, sinking dread that these weren't just mistakes. They were blueprints of a life he was building behind her back. Every piece of proof she found was a hammer blow to the foundation of their home. She kept it all buried, nursing her suspicion like a slow-burning coal, waiting for the moment the evidence became undeniable. She wasn't just losing her husband. She was watching him decompose in real time, stripping away the man she had loved to reveal the secret stranger underneath. She was waiting for the day the evidence would finally force her hand, preparing herself to walk away from the life they had built before it destroyed what little was left of her. The sun was a pale, thin blade cutting through the morning mist when she dropped the children off, her 5-year-old and her 3-year-old, their small, sleepy faces the last tether to the life she was about to incinerate. She left them in the safety of her sister's house, their faces fading into the distance, and turned the car toward the ghost of their past. She drove to the house they had bought when the world first started handing them success. It was a place held in the tight, suffocating grip of the woods, sitting low and heavy by the water's edge. It was their first real fortune. A big money house on an old silver-black lake, shielded from the world by miles of dense, silent timber. The neighbors were 10 minutes of gravel and shadow away, leaving the property in a state of absolute deafening isolation. As she pulled into the drive, the scent of pine rushed in, sharp, resinous, and cold. The house didn't welcome her, it loomed. This was the sanctuary of their early years, a place where they had once built a foundation of dreams, but now it felt like a tomb. The air here was heavy with the weight of the 2 years she had spent collecting the shards of his betrayal. She didn't come for a conversation. The realization hit her not with a shout, but with the cold, precise click of a puzzle piece locking into place. She sat in her car, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the screen of her laptop, where the evidence sat in black and white. It was the utilities that killed her. Years ago, when they had moved into the manor, that sprawling, echoing monument to their success, Grant had been adamant. They had signed the papers, handed over the keys, and supposedly shuttered the lake house. It was a closed chapter, a relic of their starter days. But the records she'd spent 2 years hunting down told a different story. The accounts were active, the water was running, the electricity was being drawn. There was a scheduled gardener, A man who showed up twice a week to prune the hedges and cut the grass, ensuring the place never looked abandoned, ensuring anyone who lived there stayed comfortable and remained safe. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning bone white. The silence of the car felt pressurized, suffocating. Her mind began to race, sketching out the horrors that lived behind the locked doors she hadn't yet touched. She started to build the portrait of this shadow life. If the house was running, it was being lived in. How many, she wondered, the question burning in her throat. Were there children running through those halls? Were there toys scattered on the porch, small shoes discarded by the door, the same way her own children's shoes sat in their entryway at home? She tried to visualize the woman. Was she a ghost of who Diane used to be, or something entirely different? Did she look like her? Did she talk like her? Did she have the same laugh they used to make Grant soften before the walls went up? The thought that he might be playing house, that he might be trading their life for a mirror image of it, made her skin crawl. It wasn't just an affair, it was a structural replacement. She stared out at the dark tree line, the lake house waiting for her just a few miles down the road. She hadn't crossed the threshold yet, but she was already living in the aftermath. She felt like a detective staring at a crime scene before the tape was even up. She was going to go in. She was going to see the faces of the people who had occupied the space where her husband's loyalty should have been. She just didn't know if she was preparing to find a mistress, a second family, or a life that made hers look like the fabrication. She just knew that whatever was behind those doors, she was going to peel it back until there was nothing left to hide. She shoved the front door open, expecting to be met with the warm, lived-in reality of her worst nightmares. She braced for the sight of another life, a dining table set for 4, children's toys in the corner, the soft clutter of a home. But the air that rushed out to greet her wasn't the scent of a secret family. It was sterile, pressurized and empty. She stepped over the threshold, her pulse hammering against her ribs, and stopped cold. The house wasn't a home, it was a laboratory. The space was hollowed out, completely stripped of furniture, curtains, or any sign of human warmth. It was a vacuum, a tomb of white walls and bare floorboards. Yet, it was vibrating with life. Every room was hummed with the aggressive, mechanical drone of industrial-grade air purifiers and dehumidifiers running at max capacity, scrubbers clicking in a rhythm that felt like a dying heartbeat. The air was unnaturally thin, stripped of all scent, all dust, all humanity. And then she saw them. Massive, professional-grade speakers were bolted into the corners, their black, gaping mouths aimed directly at the windows and the doors pointed outward like sentries. They weren't there to play music. They were positioned to create a wall of sound, a sonic fence intended to swallow any whisper of what happened inside, or perhaps to ensure that absolutely nothing from the outside could ever drift in. She stood in the center of the hollowed-out living room, the silence between the hum of the purifiers ringing in her ears. The dread that had been a burning heat in her chest for 2 years suddenly turned to ice. She hadn't found a mistress. She hadn't found a second family. She had found a containment unit. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her footsteps echoing sharply against the bare wood, and realized with a sickening, cold clarity, this wasn't where he went to live a double life. This was where he went to hide something that could never be allowed to touch the world. She stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the mechanical shriek of the air purifiers and the black, staring eyes of the speakers. They were positioned like silent sentries, the implications making the hair on her arm stand up. She knew with a cold, absolute certainty that he was here, somewhere within these hollowed-out walls. Yet the house remained terrifyingly still. It didn't breathe with the presence of a man. It hummed with the sterile, rhythmic pulse of a machine. She moved toward the kitchen, her steps echoing with a hollow, unnatural clarity against the bare floorboards. Every instinct she possessed, every frantic alarm bell in her mind, screamed at her to turn back, to run toward the sunlight and the life she had left behind. "This is not a home," her intuition whispered, a dark, jagged truth. "This is a vessel for something else." And yet, she was tethered to the hunt. She moved with a desperate, self-destructive momentum, pulled forward by a hunger for the truth that eclipsed her own survival. She entered the kitchen, a room stripped of its soul, its cabinets ripped away to reveal the raw, exposed nerves of the architecture. She scanned the counters, the empty stove, the vast silver pots that sat like iron urns. She began to scrub. It was a bizarre, compulsive reaction. She found herself running her hand over the grimeless surfaces, checking for anything, a fingerprint, a discarded hair, a drop of water that might prove a human lived here. The fear was thickening in the air, a metallic tang that coated her tongue. The atmosphere felt wrong, bloated with a pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. She knew she shouldn't be looking, that whatever she was about to unearth was not meant for her eyes, but she was past the point of turning back. She was a woman unraveling the fabric of her own reality, stitch by agonizing stitch, terrified of what lay underneath, but unable to stop her hands from tearing the seams apart. The kitchen felt like a pantomime of a life that never existed, a hollow stage set she was haunting for no reason. She knew the bathroom would be just as sterile, no splash of color, no mundane detritus of a human existence, no soft towels or personal mess. She knew she wouldn't find a bedroom with a half-made bed or a flicker of a television screen. This place wasn't meant for living. It was meant for something else entirely. She was pulled toward the basement door. It was the only place left, the dark, subterranean gut of the house. As she reached the top of the stairs, her hand hovering over the cold, painted wood of the door, the house suddenly shuddered. The massive speakers mounted in the living room and hallway jolted to life with a violent electric crackle. It was their music, their wedding music, the melody that once felt like the soundtrack to their golden future. But now it was distorted, stripped of its grace. The bass was a physical assault, so heavy it vibrated in the marrow of her teeth, rattling the very foundations of the floorboards beneath her feet. It was a cacophony of sound designed to drown out everything, a sonic wall meant to erase whatever was happening down in the dark. And then she heard it. Through the thrumming, vibrating bass, a sound cut through the music like a razor through silk, a high, thin, ragged wail. It was a scream. It wasn't a cry of surprise. It was the sound of something seeing its end coming soon. It spiraled up from the basement, strangled by the sheer volume of the music, and she realized with a sickening jolt that Grant wasn't just hiding a double life. He was hiding a scream. She stood at the top of the basement door, and the first thing that hit her wasn't the sound, it was the air. It was a chemical assault, a thick, suffocating fog that clawed at the back of her throat and burned her eyes. It was the sharp, eye-watering tang of ammonia clashing with the aggressive, nose-numbing sting of bleach. Beneath that, the heavy, metallic bite of peroxide clung to the dampness, and over it all, a frantic, nauseating layer of fake lemon and harsh pine cleanser was plastered on top. She began her descent, her hand sliding down the railing, her stomach heaving with every step. As she moved deeper into the stairwell, the walls transformed. They weren't wood or drywall anymore. They were encased in heavy industrial-grade plastic, slick, translucent sheets that clung to the studs like a second weeping skin. They shimmered under the dim bulb of the stairwell, sweating a mixture of condensation and chemical residue that dripped steadily onto the steps. With every footfall, the plastic crinkled, a sharp, aggressive sound that seemed to telegraph her presence into the dark. The walls were weeping, the plastic shimmering with a dull, sickly light as it hugged the structure of the house, turning the basement into a pressurized, hermetically sealed tomb. The smell became a physical weight, a concentrated slurry of every disinfectant ever made, so potent it tasted like salt and copper on her tongue. It was the smell of a crime that was being scrubbed out of existence over and over again until the very air was toxic. As she neared the bottom, her eyes scanned the weeping plastic-sheathed walls. They were layered, thick enough to muffle the world, yet they couldn't hide the rot behind them. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, slick surface of the plastic, and it shivered under her touch, a dead synthetic membrane between her and the monstrosity that waited just on the other side. She should have run. Every primal instinct screamed at her to turn back, to crawl out of this hell and back into the sunlight where her children were waiting. But her legs were dead weight, moving with a horrific magnetic pull. She rounded the corner of the plastic-draped corridor, and the world stopped. There he was, Grant, the man for whom she had abandoned her parents, the man who had been the heartbeat of her life, the architect of their golden empire. He wasn't a husband anymore. He was a monster presiding over an altar of agony. He was perched on a small, rusted stool, framed by the skeletal remains of their mahogany marriage bed. He had dismantled it, carried it down piece by piece, and reassembled it here, in this weeping tomb, as the centerpiece for his depravity. And on that bed lay a girl, a nurse, her white scrub stark against the dark, slick plastic, her eyes hidden behind a thick, suffocating blindfold. Her wrists were chained to the heavy mahogany frame, her breath coming in shallow, shuddering gasps that were almost drowned out by the music. Grant was leaning over her feet. With the rhythmic, terrifying patience of a man tending to an intricate craft, he had tied a thin, high-tensile wire tight around the base of her toes. Diane's eyes dilated, her brain refusing to piece together what she was seeing until the blade moved. He didn't hack, he sliced. He worked with a surgical, clinical precision, severing the flesh with a slow, agonizing grace. The nurse didn't scream like a human. She let out a long, hollow sound of absolute, shattered extinction. It was a noise that didn't just pierce the room. It tore through Diane's soul. Then came the beat. The wedding song erupted through the speakers, the bass vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the very marrow of Diane's bones. The music boomed, distorted and euphoric, a hellish anthem that turned the blood pooling on the plastic floor into a rhythmic, macabre dance. Grant didn't look up, his hand steady, his expression one of serene, academic focus, as if he were just performing a necessary daily chore. Diane felt her knees buckle, but she couldn't collapse. She was witnessing the total erasure of her life, the man she loved exposing himself as a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for all those golden years. The smell of ammonia burned her nose, the music deafened her, and the sight of her husband, carefully, methodically, lovingly, dismantling a life before him broke something inside her that would never, ever heal. He didn't just take the nurse's toes. He took Diane's past, her future, and every memory she had of being loved. He was a creature of the dark, and she had walked right into the center of his hunger. The heavy plastic curtains slapped against her shoulders like wet, grasping hands as she lunged into the dark, the chemical stench clinging to her clothes, a suffocating perfume of his secret industry. Her feet didn't touch the stairs. She felt as though she were falling upward, fueled by a terror so pure it turned her blood to ice. Behind her, the music surged. That wedding song, that damnation of a melody, swelling into a crescendo that vibrated through the very frame of the house. The distorted crescendo followed her, a sonic predator chasing her toward the surface, echoing off the weeping walls like a mocking promise. She slammed into the basement door, her fingers clawing at the wood, the handle slick with her own sweat. She didn't look back. She couldn't. To look back was to acknowledge that he was coming, that he had heard the crinkle of the plastic, that he had noticed the audience he had been waiting for. She burst into the kitchen, the light of the outside world, dim, grey and indifferent, streaming through the windows like a physical assault. She stumbled over her own feet, the floorboards screaming under her frantic exit. Her mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting nothing but the sterile horror of that room. The sight of the nurse's toes being severed with clinical, methodical precision. The way the stark, translucent plastic sheathing, the walls seemed to sweat under the harsh humming lights, and the agonizing, rhythmic finality of each cut. She collapsed into the center of the kitchen, the room where she had once cooked their meals and laughed about their future. It was a gutted shell now, smelling of that sharp, antiseptic cocktail. Ammonia, bleach, and bitter citrus. But the reality of the room didn't matter. The floorboards were cold, unforgiving, and she curled into a ball on them, her body racking with a grief that felt like a physical rupture. She wasn't just crying for the horrific scene in the basement. She was mourning the death of the man she had loved for 6 years. She was weeping for every memory, every promise, every shared dream that had just been revealed as a grotesque lie. She wanted her Grant back, not the monster in the plastic tomb, but the partner, the best friend, the man who had been her entire world. That version of him was dead, and she was already grieving him with a ferocity that tore at her throat. Suddenly, the basement door, the heavy, sound-dampening barrier he had built, burst open. The sound of his voice shattered the air, raw and desperate. "Diane!" He wasn't shouting in anger. He was screaming her name with a heavy, primal fear, a sound of absolute frantic loss. When he reached the kitchen, he skidded to a halt, his chest heaving, his hands still slick with the work he had been doing. His eyes, usually so calculated and calm, were wide and shattered. As he looked at her, crumpled on the floor, he didn't reach for her. He didn't approach. He froze. In that moment of agonizing silence, she saw it clearly. The same hollow, soul-deep mourning reflected in his gaze. He realized, with a clarity that rivaled her own, that he hadn't just been caught, he had been exposed. He looked at her, his lips trembling, and she saw the terrifying realization dawn on him. He had lost his anchor. He had lost the only person who truly knew him. And in this kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of their empty life, they were both standing over the grave of everything they had ever been. The kitchen became a claustrophobic cage of shared agony. The industrial hum of the air purifier still vibrated through the floor, but it was drowned out by the muffled, thumping bass of the wedding song bleeding in from the living room. That distorted, cyclical music pulsed through the walls like a mocking, artificial heartbeat, punctuating the silence between them. Grant stood in the threshold of the basement door, his silhouette stark against the darkness behind him. His hands, slick, stained, and trembling, hung at his sides. The frantic, terrified cry of her name that had preceded him now curdled into a suffocating, heavy silence. He didn't move toward her. He seemed afraid that if he took a single step, the thin veneer of reality holding him together would shatter completely. Diane remained curled on the floor, the cold wood pressing into her skin. Her eyes locked on his face. "Diane," he breathed, his voice breaking, stripped of its usual authority. It was a plea, a frantic, desperate attempt to reclaim the version of him that had existed before she stepped down those stairs. But the kitchen, gutted and empty, offered no sanctuary. He took a half step forward, his gaze frantic, searching her face for the woman he had loved, the woman who had been his partner, his confidant, his world. But she looked back at him through a haze of tears, mourning him in real time, watching the man she adored dissolve into the monster he had been all along. The music in the living room swelled again, that wedding song, reaching a hideous grinding crescendo, the bass vibrating through the floorboards and rattling their very teeth. They were two people standing on the wreckage of an empire, both realizing that the intimacy they had shared was now the very thing that made this betrayal absolute. He didn't touch her. He couldn't. He just stood there, drowning in the sound of their vows, waiting for her to tell him if he was still the man she married, or if he was the butcher she had just discovered. The space between them in the kitchen was no longer air. It was a vacuum of absolute, suffocating grief. Diane didn't see a monster. Her mind, in a desperate, protective fracture, had already begun to rewrite the reality of the room. He wasn't the butcher. He was dead. She was standing in the kitchen as a widow, staring at the ghost of a man who had been ripped from her life. He moved toward her then, his hands reaching out, and she didn't flinch. She let him take her hand. His skin was cold, trembling violently, and the residue of his industry, the faint, metallic, chemical ghost of his work, smudged from his fingers onto hers. It was an ache, a tactile reminder of the slaughter. But in her shock, it felt only like the cold sweat of a man who had just survived something terrible. "I'll clean all that up," he whispered, the words drifting through the room with that same familiar cadence, a melodic, golden anchor that had held her steady through every storm of their 6 years together. It was a cruel dissonance, the warmth of his voice scraping against the cold, quiet brutality of what lay between them. "I'll make it vanish. Go home, Diane. Please, just go home. I'll be home before dark." She nodded, a mindless, hollow motion. She was a passenger in her own skin, letting her husband, her leader, her confidant, tell her how to survive the loss of him. She felt the overwhelming, crushing love pouring out of him. Not the love of a killer, but the agony of a man who knew he had just destroyed the only thing that kept him tethered to humanity. She drove home in a trance. For 3 days, she lived in a fragile, artificial peace. She cooked, she scrubbed the counters, she kissed her children. Then, she was standing in their kitchen, the real kitchen, the one with cabinets and light, when the truth surged up and shattered the dam. The scream didn't start in her lungs. It started in her marrow. It was a jagged, piercing sound that tore through the quiet house, a cry of mourning that morphed into a howl of betrayal. Grant was sitting at the table, his posture slumped, watching as she tore their life apart. She was grabbing everything that could fit in her luggage. She wasn't running for her life. She wasn't even afraid for her babies. She knew, with that same illogical, sickening certainty, that he would never touch a hair on their heads. She turned on him, her face a mask of ruined beauty, her voice cracking under the weight of the impossible. "How?" she screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, vibrant with the fury of a woman who had just realized her best friend was a stranger. "How could you do this? What are you? What are you?" She gestured wildly at the empty air, her eyes wild. "Who were they, Grant? Who were they?" Grant didn't look up. He didn't offer a defense, or a reason, or a justification. He couldn't. How do you explain the shadows to the one person who was supposed to be your light? He sat there, a hollow man witnessing the end of his world, knowing that while he was a monster to the world, to her, he was just a tragedy she could no longer bear to hold. The house was finally quiet, a silence so thick it felt like the walls were closing in to crush the air out of the rooms. The front door had just clicked shut, the latch engaging with a finality that sounded like a tomb being sealed. He stood in the center of the kitchen, the lingering scent of her perfume, the sharp, hysterical tang of her fear, was clawing at his resolve. He was a man who had looked at the worst of humanity and remained steady, but now he crumbled. He didn't make a sound. He didn't want the silence to catch him, didn't want the air to know he was breaking. He cried the way men do. He sat at that dining room table, his elbows on the hard surface, his palms jammed in his eyes. His shoulders were jerking violently, bouncing with the jagged, rhythmic hitching of a man struggling to breathe under the weight of an ocean. He was pulling at his own grief, trying to physically extract the image of her leaving, the memory of her eyes as she looked at him, not as her husband, but as a void. Outside, the crunch of gravel under the tires of her car was the only world left. He tracked the sound with agonizing precision, his body shuddering with every foot the car moved away from him, pulling him further into the wreckage of his own design. He stayed there, silently weeping alone, while the now hollow house, the home where he had planned to spend the rest of his life, slowly became nothing more than a monument to the man he had forced himself to kill. The 14 days that followed were a tedious exercise in logistics. He moved through his professional life in the city with a polished, synthetic charm, greeting colleagues with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Grant, desperate to win her back, became possessed by a singular, desperate resolve. He would undo the poison he had poured into their lives, starting by tearing down every hollow structure and deceptive facade he had built to hide his bloody hobby. Back at the lake house, the silence felt heavy, charged with the wreckage of who he had been. The atmosphere was one of dull, necessary deconstruction. To him, the gutting of the basement was less a crime scene cleanup and more the annoying logistical closing of a branch that had simply ceased to be profitable. It was a chore, like clearing out an overgrown crawl space or discarding spoiled inventory. He approached the work with the same clinical detachment he'd applied to the harvest. The industrial-grade plastic, the weeping, synthetic skin of his industry, came down with a series of wet, snapping sounds. He rolled the sheets into heavy-duty bags without a second thought. They were just materials, and he was finally reclaiming his space. The refrigeration units were the most tedious part. He emptied them with a rhythmic, mechanical focus, tossing the contents into the industrial incinerator he'd installed behind the boathouse. He didn't dwell on what was being burned. It was just organic matter, biological clutter that had outlived its utility. The heavy stock pots, the ones he'd scrubbed until the metal shone like new, were unceremoniously stacked and hauled to the curb, a collection of kitchenware that had served their purpose and were now nothing more than scrap. Even the sound system, once the source of his distorted bass-heavy anthems, was dismantled. He unscrewed the speakers from the walls, the wires hanging like exposed dead veins. He felt a flicker of irritation that he had to deal with the acoustics of a space that would soon be silent. He worked in a state of quiet, dull resentment. It was a nuisance to have to dispose of the tools of his hobby, the hooks, the serrated blades, the heavy mahogany bed frame that he finally hacked into manageable pieces with a reciprocating saw. It felt like downsizing a life he had curated with such precision. He didn't miss the work. He missed the order of it, the quiet industry of his private world. But as he wiped a smear of grime from his cheek, he felt a strange, flat lightness. He was gutting the lake house, stripping it down to the studs, effectively bleaching the memory of what he had been. He was pruning his life, cutting away the dead weight to survive, waiting for the day he could convince her, or perhaps just himself, that the man she saw in that basement had been nothing more than a fever dream. The last piece was the nurse. She was a hollow, weightless thing now, her body a collection of disconnected logistics that he had to dispose of before the lake house could return to a state of neutral, empty silence. He stood in the dim, stale air of the basement, holding her head, wrapped in the same heavy industrial plastic that had once been his altar. He froze. For a heartbeat, the clinical detachment cracked. The stillness of the room was suddenly invaded by a vivid, searing rush of memory. He wasn't just a man cleaning a basement. He was a man reliving the intoxicating dark heat of those nights. He remembered the thrill of the hunt, the way the late-night air at the bus stop had tasted like static, and the absolute primitive surge of adrenaline that had flooded his veins when he first took her. He felt the phantom heat of her blood, that rhythmic, pulsing vitality reaching his lips, a metallic, iron-sweet nectar that had always served as the apex of his industry. It was a dark, seductive hunger that had lived in his loins, a predatory electricity that made him feel like a god. He remembered the exquisite, agonizing beauty of dismantling a life, the way he had taken her apart finger by finger, toe by toe, with a precision that bordered on religious devotion. It had been his symphony, his way of imposing his will upon the chaos of the world. But he was done. He had to be. His hands, slick with the remnants of his work, trembled against the plastic. This girl, this bus stop find, this harvest, was the turning point. The realization hit him with a heavy, sickening finality. The very thing that had brought him his deepest, most primal satisfaction had become the anchor that cost him everything. It had become the price of his life as he knew it. He stared down at the bundle in his arms, the heat of his own desire now curdling into a cold, hollow revulsion. The hobby was a dead weight. The beauty was gone, replaced by the crushing, suffocating absence of Diane's love. He didn't feel like a master anymore. He felt like a fool who had hollowed out his own sanctuary to satisfy a hunger that had ultimately consumed his world. It had been 20 years since that day in the kitchen. 20 years of living in a house built on silence and calculated proximity. He wasn't ancient, but time had been a slow, grinding weight. He was 55, yet he felt like a relic, tethered to the bed by the rhythmic, intrusive hiss-clack of his CPAP machine. The mask was his modern penance. It strapped across his face, a plastic cage that forced his breath into a steady, mechanized cadence, denying him the freedom to speak, to joke, or to spin the stories that had once bridged the gap between them. It was a barrier he was forced to wear every night, a literal obstruction between his lips and her ear. He longed to reach out, to bridge the distance, to finally start the work of repairing the damage, to bond in the way they had before the world shifted. But the machine wouldn't allow it. It sat there, a mechanical sentinel, dictating his rhythm and silencing his pleas. He shifted, the plastic tubing dragging against the sheets, and looked at her. She on her back beside him, the same detached, composed posture she had held for 2 decades. Her sleeping pills heavy in her breathing. She was there, as she always was, duty fulfilled. But the chasm between them remained as vast as the day she had sat him down at the dining table. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, reaching past the hose and the wires toward hers. He was tired of the silence. He wanted, with a desperate, crushing ache, to be seen, not as the husband who had failed, But as the man who was still fighting for a scrap of her warmth, his fingers brushed her skin. Hard. Still. The CPAP machine pushed a gust of air into his lungs, a loud, artificial sound that punctuated the intimacy he was trying to claw back. He curled his fingers around hers, his palms slick against her skin. It was a fumbling, needy gesture, the reach of a man who had spent 20 years in purgatory. He waited, the mask pressing into his cheeks, his heart stuttering. He felt the coldness of her hand, the absolute practiced stillness she had perfected over 2 decades. And then, the impossible happened. Beneath his palm, he felt a faint, ghost-like movement, a slow, agonizingly deliberate tension in her fingers. He didn't dare breathe, terrified that even a shudder would shatter the moment. Squeeze. It was weak, barely a tremor, but it was there, a slow, rhythmic pressure against his palm. For the first time in 20 years, she had returned his touch. He didn't know if it was pity, a final surrender, or the ghost of the woman she had once been. But as he lay there, held in the grip of the only thing he had ever truly loved, he allowed himself to feel forgiven.